Australia just had an election. The result was pretty surprising to people. There'd been 3 years of polling and a lot of media narrative uh, anticipating that the Labor Party was going to win, and in particular that they were going to win crusading for a carbon emissions cuts and larger targets for renewable energy. And instead, what happened was that was all rejected in favor of a liberal-led center-right coalition, liberal-led in terms of the Australian Liberal Party, headed by their Prime Minister Scott Morrison. And the implication is that voters were more concerned about lowering energy prices and increasing energy supply, in particular from coal. And one interesting dynamic that I think has some lessons here is that in Australia, the left is losing the working class and has more and more become representative of the highly educated and high income earners. And I think we were starting to see at least some of that dynamic here, where even labor unions have come out opposing the Green New Deal. And I think one takeaway for the US is that there's been increasing instances of people in the business community and among Republicans that they need to get on board the climate change train and start supporting things like a carbon tax. And I think that is a mistake morally, but that there's also reason to think that it's a mistake politically as well, that if you actually have a pro-energy, pro-progress agenda, that can be really powerful, particularly if you actually have a coherent stance on climate, which is one of the things we've urged people to develop.
So is there anything specifically that they're doing in Australia that you take any lessons from in terms of messaging, anything like that?
I mean, I haven't seen followed closely the exact messaging that was used, but there was a real focus on cost. And I think sometimes this can be done poorly, but when people really have a sense of the price tag of restrictive policies, and if you'll recall, a few years back, Australia actually had, I think it was a carbon tax, or it was some form of carbon pricing, and that actually led to change in government and repealing that. When people actually have a price tag on these things, then you can have, I think, a winning argument. But the more vague it is that, oh, this will be expensive, the less effective that seems to be.
I wonder in that country, and maybe you don't know this, but is there, it seems like with the carbon tax and maybe with some of the reliability issues, but I'm just speculating, maybe they feel like they have familiarity of paying the price of those kinds of policies. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, so I mentioned two things that were relevant. So one was the price, but one was just the having an increased energy supply. And I think that goes to the point that they have struggled with, we've talked about in the past some of the problems that they've had. And I don't have a good sense of how much that is attributed to intermittent renewables, like their sense that we don't have reliable energy. But there's definitely a dual concern, both with making sure we have available energy and making sure that it's affordable.
Yeah, well, this makes me think about in the US awareness or lack of awareness of what the unreliables have done to energy costs. And one point I've heard a couple of times, including in Mark Mills of the Manhattan Institute's paper on, I think it's called The New Energy Economy, and Exercise in Magical Thinking. It definitely has magical thinking in the title. He talks about how in the US there's very strong reason to believe that absent the unreliables, prices would have declined because the fuel costs, like the raw fuel costs in terms of coal and gas, which end up being something like 50% of or 25% of electricity cost, those actually went down significantly. And so when you see prices going up everywhere, one thing that points to is that the unreliables didn't just add cost, but they added cost to lower cost. And the more that people can be aware, okay, forcing you to use unreliable fuels drove up your prices this much, and then it'll do it more in the future. We have every reason to believe it'll do it more in the future. Then you're really making them then really making people aware, at least partially making people aware of the trade-offs involved. And then you can explain further that the trade-offs are actually much bigger, because it's not just your electricity bill, but when everyone's electricity bill is higher, that makes everyone less productive, and that makes everything more expensive for you.